Bruno vanished from a quiet Vermont town before dawn. Hours later, the old German shepherd was found under a bridge, trembling by the river, then suddenly lunged toward the reeds with a fierce, broken growl. The FBI agent's K9 followed, and the rescue team froze. A Navy SEAL lay unconscious there, clutching a broken tracker from Bruno's collar. If you believe God sends help before hope disappears, leave amen. North Haven, Vermont, looked like the kind of town that had never learned how to raise its voice. It sat near the silver-blue shoulder of Lake Champlain, tucked between maple woods, clean white steeples, and narrow roads that curved gently past old barns and stone walls. On Saturday mornings, the farmers' market filled the town square with baskets of apples, jars of honey, folded quilts, fresh bread, and the sweet smell of blueberry pies cooling under striped cloth. The air carried that early autumn brightness found only in the north, when the trees were just beginning to turn and the lake seemed to hold the sky in both hands. Special Agent Mara Ellison stepped into that light with the quiet posture of a woman who had learned to listen before she spoke. She was 30 years old, tall and slender, with fair skin, gray-green eyes, and dark brown hair pinned in a low bun beneath the collar of her Navy FBI jacket. People often mistook her silence for coldness. They were wrong. Mara's silence was a room where she kept every detail safe until it mattered. Beside her walked Alder, her 5-year-old German shepherd, a strong sable-coated K9 with a black saddle, golden brown highlights, alert ears, and amber eyes that seemed old enough to remember storms no one had told him about. Alder was trained to find hidden electronics, trackers, small devices, memory chips. But Mara trusted something in him no training manual could explain. She had come from the FBI Boston field office because Riverbend Renewal House, a shelter network for women starting over, had found something wrong in its records. 5 women in 4 states had been located by men they had tried to leave behind. One of those women was Evelyn Mercer, a quiet baker now living in North Haven under a new name. On paper, Mara was here to assist local police and speak at a community safety booth. In truth, she was watching the small things. Who looked over their shoulder, who avoided cameras, who froze when a vehicle slowed down. A group of children gathered around Alder near the apple stand. One small boy with freckles and a missing front tooth pointed at the dog's vest and asked, "Does he have his own badge?" Before Mara could answer, a man passing with a paper bag and a folded service cap said, "He outranks most of us." The children laughed. Mara turned. The man was Caleb Rowan, though Mara did not know his name yet. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair, a close-trimmed beard, and the steady face of someone who had learned not to waste movement. A dark field jacket covered most of his Navy service uniform, but the clean collar and polished shoes gave away where he had just been. He had spoken that morning at North Haven High, where the town honored former students serving in the military. Now he stood in the market like any local son home for the weekend, accepting greetings with small nods and answering kindness as if it embarrassed him a little. "Caleb Rowan," called June Bellamy from the diner tent, a round-faced woman in her late 60s with silver curls, warm brown skin, and a voice that could sweeten coffee from across the room. "You take this to Evelyn, and do not pretend you are too full for pie. Navy SEAL or not, you still eat like a boy who lost a fight with a lunchbox." Caleb accepted the bag with a faint smile. "Yes, ma'am." Mara noticed that people loved him without crowding him. That was rare. It meant he had earned their trust in ways too ordinary to become stories, repaired steps, cleared snow, carried groceries, listened when no one else had time. Across the square, Evelyn Mercer stood behind a table of blueberry hand pies. She was 58, narrow-shouldered, with pale skin, soft gray hair tucked beneath a knitted blue hat, and delicate hands that moved carefully as if sudden gestures might invite trouble. Her smile was polite, almost lovely, but it never fully reached her eyes. She kept her canvas bag locked under the table. Every time a vehicle rolled past the square, her gaze went to the road before returning to the customer in front of her. Mara approached slowly. Mrs. Mercer? Evelyn's fingers tightened around a paper sleeve. Just Evelyn, please. Alder stepped forward, then stopped. He did not bark. He did not sniff the pies, though the pies deserved serious investigation. He simply sat before Evelyn and looked up at her with a stillness that made the morning seem to pause. Evelyn tried to smile. Handsome dog. He likes honest people, Mara said. For one breath, Evelyn's face trembled. Not much, just enough. Then he is kinder than most judges of character. A truck door slammed somewhere beyond the market, sharp as a board snapping in the cold air, and Evelyn's whole body went still. The laughter around the apple stand faded behind that single sound, and Mara watched the woman's eyes search the road before her smile returned a second too late. I'm only tired, Evelyn said, already folding the cloth over her pies. Early morning. Mara did not stop her. Some frightened people ran from questions the way deer ran from headlights, not because they were guilty, but because they had survived by moving first. She only watched Evelyn leave, and Alder watched with her. Caleb left the market a few minutes later with June's paper bag on the passenger seat of his old blue pickup. He meant to stop by Evelyn's cottage, check the motion light he had installed behind her kitchen, and give Bruno, her aging German shepherd, the scraps June always wrapped by accident. Bruno was 9 years old, black and tan with a silvered muzzle, slow hips, and eyes full of stubborn devotion. The old dog trusted few men. Caleb had earned his place by never reaching too quickly. Halfway to Evelyn's lane, Caleb saw the gray SUV. It moved too slowly near the edge of town, then turned toward Whitcomb Bridge. Caleb had seen it before near Evelyn's road. He had reported it to Sheriff Nolan Pike, a heavy-set local officer with sandy hair and an easy smile, but nothing had come of it. Caleb called Pike now. No answer. He lifted his phone, took a quick photo of the plate, and sent June a message. Gray SUV. Whitcomb Bridge. Bruno. The signal near the bridge was poor. The message spun without sending. Then Caleb saw the old blanket in the back of the SUV. Bruno's blanket. At Whitcomb Bridge, mist still clung to the narrow river that fed into Lake Champlain. A lean man in a dark cap, Darren Klein, though Caleb did not know the name, was pulling Bruno from the vehicle. The old dog was weakened, but he resisted with the last proud strength of a creature who understood love better than fear. Caleb moved fast. He caught the strap near Bruno's collar and twisted loose a small plastic device clipped beneath the worn leather. Darren shoved him hard. Bruno slipped down the mossy slope below the bridge. Caleb reached for the line, caught it, held on, and for one shining second it seemed enough. Then his boot slid. Stones struck his shoulder, his head met the wet edge of a hidden rock, and the world folded into gray water and reeds. Above him, another car approached the bridge. Darren looked down, saw only brush and shadow, and fled. By the time Mara arrived with Alder, a passerby had already called for help. Bruno had been found near the lower stones, soaked, trembling, but alive. A rescue worker wrapped him in a blanket, while Evelyn's name moved through the scene like a prayer nobody wanted to say too loudly. Mara crouched near the dog. Alder sniffed the air once, then turned toward the reeds. Bruno suddenly lifted his head. A low sound rose from his chest. He staggered up, not running, not strong enough for that, but forcing himself 3 uneven steps toward the brush. His ears flattened. His body shook. He stared into the reeds as if the river had not finished speaking. Alder moved first. Mara followed. There, hidden in wet grass below the bridge, Caleb Rowan lay motionless in his damp uniform jacket, one hand closed around the broken tracker from Bruno's collar. Bruno placed himself in front of Caleb, trembling, growling softly at anyone who came too close. He was not protecting himself. He was guarding the man who had tried to save him. Alder lowered his head, calm and respectful. Bruno's growl faded. Mara knelt and pressed 2 fingers to Caleb's neck. A pulse answered, faint but present. One rescue worker stopped beside her, his face turning pale with recognition. "That's Caleb Rowan," he whispered. "He's a Navy SEAL." Mara looked at the broken device in Caleb's hand, then at Bruno standing guard with the last of his strength. The case had changed shape beneath the morning mist. This was no longer only about an old dog left to the cold river. Someone had found Evelyn, taken the creature she loved most, and harmed the man who had tried to stop it. And somewhere beyond the bridge, the gray SUV was carrying the first answer away. Caleb Rowan was taken to North Haven Community Hospital just after the mist began lifting from the river. It was a small brick building with white trim, 2 ambulance bays, and a row of maple trees standing outside like old nurses in red gold shawls. Inside, everything smelled of lemon cleaner, coffee, and quiet worry. Caleb lay in an examination room beneath a pale blanket, his dark field jacket folded over a chair and his Navy service uniform carefully loosened at the collar. The doctor had called it a concussion, mild hypothermia, and deep bruising from the fall against wet stone. He would live, but he was not going anywhere heroic today, which, in North Haven, was almost an insult to the Rowan family tradition. Mara Ellison stood near the door, reading the nurse's notes without turning a page too quickly. Her face remained calm, but inside she felt the case widening like ice cracking beneath a boot. What began as a suspicious data leak had now become a tracker, a frightened woman, a weakened dog, and a Navy SEAL found unconscious beneath a bridge. Alder lay beside her chair, his sable body still, his amber eyes half open. The German shepherd had the gift of appearing asleep while missing nothing. Every time a cart rolled past the room, one ear lifted. June Bellamy arrived with 2 paper cups of coffee and a pie box balanced against her hip. June was in her late 60s, round and sturdy, with silver curls pinned under a red scarf and warm brown skin lined by decades of laughing before breakfast. She owned Bellamy's Diner, but she ran it more like a church basement with better pancakes. "He has been doing this since he was 8, she told Mara, nodding toward Caleb. "Finding trouble, then acting surprised when trouble finds him back." "You know him well?" Mara asked. "Everyone knows Caleb Rowan," June said. "His mama taught half this town how to read. His father kept half the boats on the lake alive. And Caleb? He fixed bicycles, shoveled snow, carried groceries, repaired porch steps, and once spent 3 hours rescuing a kitten from the church drainpipe while Pastor Ellery prayed over the wrong drain." June set the pie box down and sighed. That boy has always been quiet, but quiet and empty are not the same thing. Mara looked through the glass partition at Caleb's still face. He was not handsome in an easy way. His features were too weathered for that, even at 34. Strong jaw, tired eyes, close-trimmed beard, a small line near one eyebrow from some older accident he probably never mentioned. He looked like a man shaped by duty and unfinished errands. On the chair beside him sat the folded program from the high school ceremony, proof that he had come from applause to danger without stopping to change clothes. Evelyn Mercer arrived near noon. She came in slowly, as if every hallway might ask her to explain herself. She wore a blue cardigan over a cream blouse, her gray hair tucked behind one ear, her pale hands twisting the strap of her canvas bag. At 58, she looked younger from far away and older up close, the way fear can smooth a voice while carving shadows under the eyes. When she saw Caleb through the glass, she covered her mouth. "He was only bringing Bruno a treat," she whispered. "He should never have been near that bridge." Mara did not correct her. Guilt often needed to speak before truth could enter the room. Alder rose and moved to Evelyn's side. He did not lean on her, did not demand touch. He simply lowered himself near her shoes, close enough to offer warmth, far enough to respect the invisible fence around her grief. Evelyn looked down at him, and something in her careful face loosened. "I used to live in Duluth," she said finally, "before North Haven, before the new name." Her eyes stayed on Alder as if speaking to a dog was safer than speaking to the world. "Graham Vail was my husband. People liked him. That was part of the trouble. He remembered birthdays, held doors. spoke softly in public. At home, he made the air smaller every year. Mara listened without interrupting. Evelyn told her about changing her phone number, leaving social media, moving through Riverbend Renewal House, and arriving in Vermont with one suitcase and Bruno's old leash. Still, Graham's shadow followed. Flowers with no card. A song from their early years playing from a cheap speaker left on her porch. Messages from numbers that disappeared before police could trace them. Nothing loud enough for some people to call danger. Everything sharp enough to keep her awake. Bruno was the first living soul who did not ask why I was afraid, Evelyn said. He just sat beside me until I remembered how to breathe. Down the hall, a metal tray clattered to the floor, bright and sudden, and Evelyn flinched so hard the coffee in June's hand rippled. For one breath, nobody moved. Even the hospital lights seemed to hum more softly, as if the whole building had paused to hear the sound fear made when it had no words. Then Caleb stirred. Mara stepped into the room with the nurse, a thin young man named Peter Velez, who had kind eyes and the nervous speed of someone new to emergency work. Caleb's eyelids lifted. For a moment, he looked beyond them, back toward the river. "Gray SUV?" he murmured. Mara moved closer. "Caleb, I'm Special Agent Ellison. Do you remember what happened?" His gaze found her slowly. "Bruno, bridge." He swallowed, voice rough. "Man smelled like cinnamon smoke, engine oil." He said. Caleb closed his eyes, searching through fog. "She should have stayed hidden." Evelyn made a small sound behind Mara. Caleb opened his right hand. The broken tracker sat in a sealed evidence pouch now, but his fingers curled as if they still held it. "Collar," he said. "I pulled something off Bruno's collar." "You did," Mara said. "You may have saved him." Caleb looked toward Evelyn, and regret crossed his face before pain pulled it away. "I'm sorry I didn't hold on longer." Evelyn stepped forward, trembling. "You held on enough." Sheriff Nolan Pike arrived 20 minutes later with rain-dark mud drying along the edges of his boots. Pike was a broad man in his early 50s, sandy-haired, pink-faced from cold air, with the kind of practiced smile that usually calmed town meetings and bake sale disputes. Today it did not reach his eyes. He suggested they wait before drawing conclusions. Maybe Caleb slipped while helping Bruno. Maybe the old dog had panicked. Maybe the SUV belonged to someone passing through. Mara asked, "Why was Mr. Rowan's earlier report about the gray SUV not entered properly?" Pike blinked once. "Could be clerical. We are a small office." Alder, who had been still until then, lifted his head and looked at Pike's boots. Mara noticed. She also noticed Pike noticing Alder. She said nothing. Some truths were shy animals. Chase them too early, and they vanished into the woods. June opened her pie box to break the tension and handed Caleb a slice once the nurse allowed it. He took one careful bite. A long silence followed. June narrowed her eyes. "Well?" Caleb looked at the pie, then at June. "It tastes honest." For half a second, June looked offended. Then she tasted a crumb, realized she had forgotten the sugar, and groaned so dramatically that even Evelyn laughed through tears. The sound was small, but it changed the room. Not healed, not safe, just human again. Later, Mara drove Evelyn to Dr. Lila Hartwell's veterinary clinic at the edge of town. Doctor? Hartwell was a tall woman in her early 60s with iron-gray hair in a braid, clear blue eyes, and the practical tenderness of someone who had comforted both animals and their people for many years. Bruno rested in a warming kennel wrapped in soft blankets. His silvered muzzle looked older beneath the clinic light, but when Evelyn placed her hand against the glass, his eyes opened. His tail moved once. Alder stood beside the kennel, quiet and respectful, like a younger soldier visiting an elder who had returned from a cold battlefield. Mara stepped away to examine the tracker again. Its serial number had been scraped nearly smooth, but the inner board still carried a manufacturer code. A fast database check connected that batch to a bulk purchase made through a Wisconsin transport company years earlier. The company had once belonged to Graham Vale. Mara returned to Evelyn, who was still watching Bruno breathe. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of a door closing behind the past. This is no longer local. By Monday morning, the case had grown too large for the quiet walls of North Haven. Mara Ellison sat in a small conference room at the town library where the radiator clicked like an old man clearing his throat, and autumn light spread across the table in pale gold squares. On the wall behind her, a children's poster read, "Reading opens doors." Mara looked at those words while files from Maine, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Vermont lay open before her. Doors had been opened, yes, but not the right kind. Someone had found ways into lives that had been carefully hidden. The reports had arrived like loose leaves blown from different trees. A woman in Maine had been found by a former partner after changing counties twice. A woman in New Hampshire had discovered a tiny tracker under her rear bumper. A sealed address in Minnesota had appeared in a private message thread. Evelyn Mercer's name sat in the Vermont file, small and fragile on the page, but no longer alone. A financial thread led back to Wisconsin, to a transport company that had once belonged to Graham Vale. Local police in each place had seen only one small shadow. Mara was beginning to see the shape of the man standing behind them. Alder lay under the table, his sable coat shining whenever the light touched him. His amber eyes followed Mara's hands as she sorted photos, receipts, partial plates, and tracker components. He was not magic. Mara reminded people of that whenever they began speaking of him like a church miracle with pause. Alder followed scent, circuitry, chemical traces, stress, sweat, and tiny changes in the air. The mystery was not that he found things. The mystery was that people ignored so much before a dog had to tell them where to look. Caleb Rowan had been released from the hospital that afternoon, with instructions to rest and a look on his face that said he considered rest a punishment invented by comfortable people. He arrived at the library wearing jeans, a gray sweater, and a dark jacket instead of uniform. A faint bruise shadowed one side of his forehead, and he moved carefully, not weakly, just with the discipline of a man refusing to pretend his body had not been tested. Mara made the rules clear before he sat down. He would not join a search team. He would not follow suspects. He would answer questions about roads, gates, old ferry paths, and local habits. Caleb listened without interrupting, then nodded once. "Your case," he said. "Your call." That answer did more to earn Mara's trust than any brave speech could have done. On Caleb's hand-drawn map, Whitcomb Bridge became more than a scenic old crossing. Beneath it ran a dirt road hidden by sumac, reeds, and a half-collapsed fence. Caleb tapped it with a pencil. His father, Thomas Rowan, had managed a small boat repair shed near the lake before passing away years earlier, and Caleb had spent summers hauling rope, sanding boards, and learning which roads locals used when they did not want to meet tourists. "This lane is not on the visitor map," he said. "You would only know it if somebody told you, or if you grew up sneaking fishing poles down here before breakfast." Mara looked at the line, then at the bridge photos. Darren Klein had not guessed his way there. The next lead took them east, toward a worn repair garage near the New Hampshire line. Mara did not bring Caleb inside. He stayed in the vehicle, as promised, while she and Alder met the owner, a thin man named Lloyd Brackett with tobacco-colored fingers, gray stubble, and the cautious friendliness of someone who preferred cash to questions. He admitted a gray SUV had come through for a quick look 2 days before the bridge. The customer paid in bills, kept his cap low, and smelled like cinnamon smoke. The garage camera, Lloyd claimed, had stopped working that morning. Alder did not care about excuses. He moved slowly beneath the workbench, nose brushing dust, bolts, and old oil stains. Then he stopped. His ears lifted. Mara crouched and found a narrow strip of worn leather caught on a screw under the bench. It carried the same scent pattern Caleb had described: engine oil, cinnamon smoke, cheap cologne, and the faint metallic tang of electronics. Lloyd watched the evidence bag close around it and suddenly became very interested in cleaning a wrench. A single drop of rain struck the garage roof, then another, then 100 more, drumming so suddenly that everyone went silent. In that small thunder, Alder lifted his head toward the open bay door, and Mara felt the case shift again, as if the sky itself had tapped a warning on the tin above them. That evening, the rain followed Mara back to North Haven. She stood beneath the awning of Bellamy's diner, reviewing camera stills from the square. June Bellamy wiped tables inside, her silver curls tied back with a yellow scarf, her broad face unusually serious. She had remembered something. The gray SUV had parked outside the diner 3 times, always on the days Evelyn worked the afternoon market. June confessed it with shame, twisting a dish towel in her hands. "I thought Evelyn was unfriendly," she said, always sitting where she could see the door, never staying for pie. Mara closed the laptop halfway. "Some people are not unfriendly, June. They are living in a room where every chair has to face the exit." June looked toward the window, and the rain made trembling lines across her reflection. "Then I owe that woman more pie than a body should legally eat." Mara almost smiled. Then a shadow moved behind her. A black umbrella opened over her head. She looked up and found Caleb standing beside the awning, careful not to stand too close. "You read better when the page stays dry," he said. Mara took in the umbrella, the fresh bandage near his hairline, the way he kept one hand in his pocket so she would not feel crowded. "You were told to rest." "I am standing very calmly." "That is not the same thing." "No, ma'am." The words were plain. The kindness was not. Mara returned to the laptop, but something in her chest softened against her better judgment. Alder, sitting at her side, gave Caleb a long look, then allowed the umbrella to remain. In Alder's kingdom, that was nearly a medal. The next morning, Mara visited Margaret Rowan, Caleb's mother, in a white farmhouse above the lake. Margaret was 72, tall despite her cane, with ivory skin, silver hair braided over one shoulder, and blue eyes bright enough to keep a classroom in order without raising her voice. She had taught elementary school in North Haven for 31 years. Her living room smelled of old books, lavender soap, and wood smoke. When Alder approached her chair, she slipped him a biscuit, with the smooth guilt of a retired teacher breaking cafeteria rules. "Caleb was always that way," Margaret said, watching her son through the kitchen window as he pretended not to listen from the porch. "Once, when he was 9, a fledgling fell from the maple. He slept outside all night in a raincoat because he thought raccoons might come. His father told him you cannot guard everything. Caleb said, 'Maybe not, but I can guard this.'" Mara looked out at him. He had turned his face toward the lake, pretending the wind needed his attention. By late afternoon, Riverbend Renewal House sent over its internal access logs. One name appeared again and again before the leaks began: Tessa Moreland. She was a former intake assistant, 36, narrow-faced, with dyed auburn hair and tired hazel eyes in her employee photo. Her debt records showed pressure. Her messages showed fear. Graham had not simply paid her, he had lured her through a false support group, convinced her one harmless address would help correct an unfair legal matter, then used that act to hold her in place. Tessa had opened doors she could no longer close. At dusk, Evelyn called Mara from her cottage. Her voice was thin. A package had been left on her porch with no return address. Mara arrived with Alder and found Evelyn standing inside the open doorway, pale beneath the porch light. On the table lay Bruno's old collar, cleaned and folded beside a map. Red marks circled Evelyn's cottage, Dr. Hartwell's clinic, Whitcomb Bridge, and one more place near the lake. Caleb, who had come only because Mara asked him to identify the final mark, stared at it for a long moment. The color left his face. "That is the old ferry gate," he said. "My father kept the key there when I was a boy." Mara looked from the map to Evelyn, then back to Caleb. "A stranger would not know that gate," Caleb said quietly. And in the hush that followed, the river outside North Haven seemed to keep flowing, carrying secrets it had never meant to keep. By the next morning, Evelyn Mercer's little cottage no longer belonged only to her. An unmarked FBI sedan sat near the maple trees, a state police cruiser waited 2 houses down, and a plainclothes agent walked the lane as if he were admiring bird feeders instead of watching every car that slowed. The place was safer now. That should have comforted Evelyn. Instead, she stood behind her lace curtain with both hands wrapped around a teacup she had not tasted, feeling the old walls of fear change shape around her. Once, Graham Vale had made her life small by asking where she was going, who had called, why she had smiled at the mailman. Now protection had placed new eyes around her, kinder eyes, lawful eyes, but still eyes. Safety, she thought, could feel like a cage when a woman had spent too many years hearing locks. Mara Ellison understood more than Evelyn expected. The young agent stood in the kitchen, her dark hair pinned low, her gray-green eyes steady, but not hard. Alder sat beside her boot, his sable coat brushed by the morning light, his ears moving with every sound beyond the window. "You want to see Bruno?" Mara said. Evelyn looked down. "I know it is foolish." "No," Mara said. "It is human." The visit was arranged carefully. 2 vehicles, a quiet route, no public announcement, no unnecessary uniforms. Caleb Rowan asked to come, and Mara's answer came before his sentence finished. "You are not part of the operation." Caleb stood on Evelyn's porch in a navy sweater and worn jacket, the bruise near his temple fading to a pale shadow. He looked better than he had in the hospital, but not whole. His posture carried discipline, and his face held that quiet restraint of a man used to discomfort and unwilling to make it a room's main subject. "I know," he said. "I will not lead. I will not engage. I will just keep the door open." Mara watched him for a second longer than she meant to. There was no pride in his voice, no hunger to be seen as useful, only a simple wish to stand where a frightened woman might need a calm shape beside her. "You stay where I put you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Doctor." Lila Hartwell's veterinary clinic sat near a line of birch trees at the edge of town, bright with clean windows and hanging plants that looked too cheerful for the grief that often passed through its doors. Inside, Bruno lay in a warming kennel beneath soft blankets. The old German shepherd's black and tan coat had dried, his silver muzzle looked softer in the clinic light, and his eyes opened when Evelyn entered, as if her footsteps were a language he knew from another life. Evelyn knelt. "Hello, my brave boy." Bruno pushed himself up. Not far, not easily. His legs trembled beneath him, and Dr. Hartwell moved closer but did not interfere. Bruno took one step, then another, then a third that seemed to cost him half the strength left in the world. Evelyn opened her arms, and the old dog placed his head against her chest. She folded around him without shame, crying into the fur at his neck. Alder stood nearby, silent and upright, then nudged a red rubber ball across the floor with one paw. It rolled softly until it touched Bruno's blanket. Mara raised an eyebrow. "A gift?" Alder looked away with great dignity. Evelyn laughed, a fragile sound, but real. From her bag she removed a new blanket, soft blue fleece with tiny white stars. She tucked it beside Bruno. Alder stared at the blanket for a little too long. "Are you jealous?" Mara asked. Alder turned his head toward the wall, offended by the suggestion. Evelyn, smiling through wet eyes, tied a small navy handkerchief loosely around Alder's neck. "For the officer who found him," she said. Alder walked 3 solemn circles around the room as if newly promoted. Then, from the rear alley, tires hissed hard on wet gravel, followed by the flat metallic slam of a van door. The clinic seemed to stop breathing. Bruno's head lifted. Alder's ears sharpened. Mara's hand moved once, quick and low, and the warmth in the room vanished into a single, listening silence. Mara stepped to the back window. A white delivery van blocked the narrow service exit. A man in a dark cap moved toward the rear door, his face half hidden, his shoulders narrow but tense. Darren Klein. Mara knew him from the blurred garage stills, from the scent trail, from the shape of a man who had spent too long following orders for cash. Evelyn was just inside the hallway, clutching her canvas bag. "Evelyn, back!" Mara said. Darren opened the door and reached for Evelyn's arm. He did not get far. Alder crossed the hallway in a streak of sable muscle and sound, planting himself between them, with a bark that struck the walls like a warning bell. Caleb moved too, but not like a man trying to own the moment. He stepped to the hinge side of the door and held it open with his shoulder, creating space for Evelyn to retreat behind Mara. No grand gesture, no reckless charge, just the right body in the right place at the right second. Darren swore under his breath, stumbled back, and ran for the van. Alder lunged only far enough to seize a piece of his sleeve before Mara called him off. The van jolted away, leaving tire tracks, a torn scrap of fabric, and the sharp smell of cheap cologne in the alley. Evelyn's canvas bag had fallen open. Caleb picked it up, brushed mud from the side, and handed it to her with both hands. Inside were letters, folded and never sent, written to women Evelyn had met through Riverbend. Names, half-addresses, memories of shelter kitchens, borrowed coats, and quiet goodbyes. Mara saw them and felt the case darken. Graham had not only wanted Evelyn, he had wanted a map of the hidden. By afternoon, Sheriff Nolan Pike stood in the clinic parking lot under a low gray sky. The easy smile he wore for town meetings had worn thin. Mara laid out the missed reports. Evelyn's calls about strange vehicles, Caleb's warning about the SUV, June's complaint about a man watching the diner, all treated like loose scraps instead of pieces of the same pattern. Pike, broad-shouldered and pale beneath his sandy hair, rubbed one hand over his jaw. "Graham called me twice," he admitted. "Said he was worried about her. Said she was confused." He sounded calm. Caleb stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Sir, a calm voice can still be lying." Pike looked at him, then at Evelyn, and something in his face lowered. He had not taken money. He had not joined Graham. He had simply believed the smoother story. Sometimes that was enough to let trouble walk through the front door. The white van led the FBI to a Shell delivery company tied to old Wisconsin transport accounts. Toll data placed Grahamvale across Lake Champlain in New York, near the old ferry district. As agents processed the clinic, Alder stopped at the rear doorframe. He sniffed once, then sat. Mara crouched and saw a tiny chalk mark near the hinge, nearly hidden beneath flaking paint. Caleb leaned closer. His face changed. "That mark belongs to the old ferry dock," he said. "Maintenance crews used it for the side gate." Mara's phone vibrated. The message had been sent to Evelyn's old number, one she had kept only for evidence. "Bring the dog's woman to the water, or more people learn where she sleeps." Mara looked from the chalk mark to Caleb, then toward the direction of the lake. Fear had chosen its stage, but this time it would not find Evelyn alone. Lake Champlain shone like hammered silver beneath the morning sun, so beautiful it almost felt dishonest. White gulls circled above the ferry landing. An American flag snapped gently from a pole near the ticket booth. Tourists stood with paper cups of coffee. Children tossed bits of bread toward the birds, and the old wooden dock creaked in rhythm with the water. North Haven's fear had come to a place where everything looked open, bright, and innocent. Mara Ellison had learned long ago that danger often preferred pretty windows. She stood beside an unmarked sedan near the edge of the ferry lot, her Navy FBI jacket zipped high against the lake wind. Alder sat at her left knee, his sable coat catching the light, the Navy handkerchief Evelyn had given him tied neatly around his neck. His ears were forward, but his body was still. To a stranger, he might have looked calm. Mara knew better. Alder was reading the air. The operation was quiet, but wide. FBI agents from Boston covered the main road. Vermont State Police watched the dock entrance. New York officers waited across the water, ready in case Grahamvale tried to cross. Caleb Rowan sat in the passenger seat of Mara's sedan with a paper map spread across his knees. He was not in uniform now, only a dark jacket over a gray shirt, the fading bruise near his temple barely visible. He had been allowed to come only because he knew the old ferry district better than any official map did. His father's boat shed had once stood 300 yards beyond the dock, where the public path ended and the maintenance road curved behind a weathered gate. "You stay in the outer perimeter," Mara said. Caleb looked up from the map. "Your case, your call." There it was again, that quiet obedience without weakness. Mara found it inconveniently reassuring. Alder rose before Mara gave the signal. The torn sleeve from Darren Klein's jacket had given them a scent trail: engine oil, cinnamon smoke, cheap cologne, and the faint chemical trace of small electronics. Alder moved past the ticket booth, around a stack of orange life rings, and toward a weathered storage shed near the back of the lot. Mara followed with 2 agents behind her. Inside the shed, dust floated in a beam of sunlight. Fishing rope hung from hooks. Old paint cans lined one wall. On a wooden crate sat a phone, its cracked screen glowing. From the speaker came a thin, tinny melody. Evelyn's old song, the one Graham had once left playing on her porch like a ghost with batteries. For one moment, Mara felt anger rise cold and clean in her chest. Not loud anger, useful anger, the kind that sharpened the edges of the world. Alder sniffed the crate, then turned away. The sound meant nothing to him. The living scent had gone elsewhere. He moved out the rear door and down a narrow path toward the low wooden walkway behind the dock. A gull cried overhead, sudden and harsh, and at that same instant the phone in the shed stopped singing. The silence that followed was so complete that even the lake seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole bright morning had paused before revealing the next name on its tongue. Evelyn was already there. She stood near the side gate, pale beneath her blue cardigan, clutching her canvas bag to her chest. A spoofed call from what looked like Dr. Hartwell's clinic had told her Bruno needed urgent transfer papers signed. A young assistant at the clinic, confused by the call and frightened by the official-sounding voice, had accidentally confirmed enough to make Evelyn believe it. And love had done the rest. Love, Mara thought, was the gentlest door and the easiest one for cruel hands to open. Across from Evelyn stood Graham Vale. He was not the monster strangers might expect. He was clean, composed, and almost handsome in a polished way. Late 50s, silver-brown hair combed neatly back, smooth jaw, expensive tan coat, clear blue eyes that never stayed warm long enough to be trusted. He looked like a man who remembered anniversaries in public and rewrote history in private. His smile carried no heat. "Evelyn," he said softly, as though they were alone in a church hallway. "You should not have come out here like this. People are worried about you." Evelyn's hands shook, but she did not step back. "Where is Bruno?" Graham gave a small wounded sigh for the benefit of 2 tourists nearby. "My wife is upset." "I am not your wife," Evelyn said. The words were thin, but they stood. Graham's eyes flickered. Mara moved from behind the weathered boathouse, Alder at her side. Caleb remained near the sedan, exactly where she had told him to be, but when Evelyn instinctively shifted backward, he stepped only half a pace sideways, opening a clear path behind her. He did not touch her, he did not speak over her, he simply made sure fear did not find a wall at her back. "Graham Vale," Mara said, her voice level. "Step away from Mrs. Mercer." Graham turned, smile still in place. "Agent Ellison, I am only trying to help a confused woman." "No," Mara said, "you are trying to control the story before the evidence catches up." She laid it out piece by piece, not for drama, but for truth. The tracker removed from Bruno's collar. Darren Klein's gray SUV. The white delivery van at Dr. Hartwell's clinic. Toll data placing Graham near the lake before sunrise. The chalk mark at the clinic door. Earl Voss opening the side gate after receiving cash. Tessa Moreland's Riverbend access logs. Caleb Rowan's statement. The old transport account in Wisconsin. The pattern of women found across state lines after trusting a system meant to keep them safe. Each fact took a little color from Graham's face. Alder stood between him and Evelyn, silent now, which somehow felt more powerful than a bark. A young Vermont trooper moved along the dock. 2 FBI agents appeared near the ticket office. Across the lot, Darren Klein was brought out from behind a parked delivery truck, wrists restrained, his dark cap gone, his narrow face empty of the confidence he had borrowed from other men's orders. Near the maintenance shed, Earl Voss, a stooped man in his 60s with a gray mustache and watery eyes, was guided toward a cruiser. Earl looked less like a villain than a man who had opened the wrong gate for the wrong money and only now heard the hinges. Graham tried to walk toward the ferry ramp. Mara's hand rose. The circle closed. He looked at Evelyn then, and the smoothness finally cracked. "You cannot live without me." Evelyn stared at him. Her face was pale. Her voice was not. "I already did." No one cheered. The words did not need it. They landed quietly, like a key turning in a lock that had waited years to open. Only after Graham was taken away did Dr. Lila Hartwell arrive at the safe area beyond the ticket booth. She stepped from her clinic van with Bruno beside her, the old German shepherd moving slowly, silver muzzle lifted, blue blanket folded in the back seat behind him. Evelyn saw him and pressed both hands to her mouth. Then she knelt, and Bruno came to her with careful steps. She wrapped her arms around him as if holding the last warm piece of home. Alder sat beside Bruno, young and steady beside old and brave, 2 shepherds facing the lake like guardians carved from loyalty itself. While agents processed Graham's belongings, Alder gave one sharp huff at a key ring dropped into an evidence tray. Mara examined it. Inside the leather fob was a hidden USB drive. Later, it would reveal names, addresses, shelter notes, and messages tied to more women than Evelyn. The case had never belonged to one house, one bridge, or one frightened heart. It had been a map of hidden lives. When the ferry dock finally quieted, Mara stood near the water, watching sunlight break across the waves. Caleb approached with a paper cup of coffee, leaving a respectful space between them. "June says heroes forget breakfast," he said. "I am not a hero." Caleb glanced toward Alder and Bruno. "Good. Heroes make terrible paperwork." Mara laughed before she could stop herself. It surprised her, that laugh. It seemed to surprise the lake, too. A few minutes later, Evelyn sat in the safe area with Bruno's head in her lap. Alder rested beside Mara's boot. Caleb stood close enough to be present, far enough not to ask for credit. Mara looked at him. "You were supposed to stay behind the line." Caleb's mouth softened, almost a smile. "I did. I just made sure the line did not move behind you." Mara had no answer ready. For once she let silence do its kinder work, and the smile stayed on her face a little longer than duty required. Several months after Graham Vale was taken from the ferry dock, North Haven learned that justice did not arrive like thunder. It came in envelopes, court dates, revised policies, sworn statements, and tired people choosing to tell the truth one more time. Autumn had deepened into the kind of Vermont season that made the hills look lit from within. The maples burned red and gold above Lake Champlain, and the river beneath Whitcomb Bridge carried fallen leaves gently, as if it had decided to return everything softer than it had received it. Graham Vale was charged in federal court for crossing state lines to stalk and threaten Evelyn Mercer, using tracking devices, exploiting stolen shelter information, and directing others to help him reach her. Darren Klein faced his own charges for taking Bruno, aiding the pursuit, and leaving Caleb Rowan beneath the bridge after the fall. Earl Voss, the ferry maintenance man with watery eyes and a bent back, admitted he had taken cash to open a side gate and mark service doors, though he claimed he had not understood the whole purpose. Tessa Moreland, the former Riverbend intake assistant with tired hazel eyes and dyed auburn hair, cooperated with investigators. She confessed that Graham had first fooled her, then trapped her with the evidence of her own mistake. None of that erased what she had done, but it helped protect other women whose names had been hidden in the USB Alder found. Riverbend Renewal House changed from the inside out. New locks, new access rules, new audits, new counselors for the women whose safety had been shaken. Sheriff Nolan Pike resigned after an internal review. At a public hearing, the once easy smile was gone from his sandy face as he admitted he had dismissed warnings because the man calling him sounded calm and the woman asking for help sounded afraid. It was not a crime to be fooled, the town learned, but it could still cost people dearly. Evelyn testified on a Tuesday morning beneath tall courthouse windows. She wore a soft blue sweater, her silver-gray hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, and in her hand she held Bruno's new collar, a simple leather band with a brass tag that caught the light whenever her fingers trembled. Mara Ellison sat 3 rows behind her, composed in a dark blazer, her gray-green eyes fixed on Evelyn's shoulders. Alder lay beneath Mara's seat, his sable body still, one paw resting over the other like a judge who had already heard enough. Caleb sat across the aisle in a plain charcoal jacket, no uniform, no medals, no attempt to be noticed. The bruise at his temple had faded, but the quiet in him remained. When Evelyn's voice shook while answering the attorney's question, Caleb did not touch her or whisper encouragement. He simply placed one steady hand on the back of the bench before her, where she could see it if she looked down. Mara saw the gesture. It asked for nothing. It only said, "There is still ground beneath you." The attorney asked why Evelyn had not left Graham sooner. Evelyn looked at the collar in her hands. "Some cages do not have bars," she said. "People outside can see the door and wonder why you do not walk through it. They do not always see how long someone has been taught that the open door is another kind of trap." The courtroom remained still, not silent from shock, but from respect. Evelyn did not sound broken. She sounded like a woman carrying the pieces of herself carefully, not because they were weak, but because they were finally hers. A shaft of sunlight slipped through the courthouse window and struck Bruno's brass tag in Evelyn's hand, flashing once across the wall like a tiny golden bell. For one suspended breath, every eye followed the light, and even Mara felt the room pause, as if hope had quietly raised its hand to testify too. After the hearing, North Haven did what small towns do when they cannot repair the past but refuse to let sorrow have the last chair. They held a benefit in the town square for the animal shelter, for Riverbend's new security fund, and for families trying to begin again. June Bellamy presided over 3 tables of apple pie with the seriousness of a general before a campaign. June was round, silver-curled, wrapped in a sunflower yellow apron, and determined to restore her baking honor after the sugarless pie incident. She handed Caleb the first slice. He tasted it under her watchful stare. "Justice has been served," June pointed a fork at him. "That is the smartest thing a Navy SEAL has said in this town all year." Laughter moved through the square like warm cider. Children drew shepherd dogs on the pavement with chalk. Someone played soft country music near the gazebo. Dr. Lila Hartwell stood beside a donation jar, tall and iron gray, pretending not to cry every time someone dropped in a bill. Bruno walked slowly beside Evelyn, his black and tan coat brushed clean, his silver muzzle lifted to the breeze. He still tired easily, but his eyes were bright. Alder walked beside him, younger, stronger, careful not to crowd him, as if escorting an elder hero through a parade nobody had officially announced. A boy with freckles looked up at Mara. "Is Bruno FBI too?" Before Mara could answer, Caleb said, "No, he is retired from being underestimated." Evelyn laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. Later, June decided that Mara and Caleb looked far too serious for people standing near a perfectly good lake. She pressed fishing rods into their hands and ordered them to the little dock behind the diner. "Standing by water without fishing is rude to water," she declared. Mara caught nothing for 20 minutes except a dented old can, which rose from the lake like a sad trophy. Alder watched her with polite disappointment. Caleb leaned on his rod and said, That counts as local history. Mara shook water from the line. I am trained for evidence recovery, apparently not fish. Fish are less cooperative. Near sunset, Evelyn walked to the path by the river below Whitcomb Bridge. A small wooden sign had been placed there, painted in careful blue letters, for every soul who was told they would not make it back. Beneath the words were 2 German shepherds, one old and one young, standing side by side toward the water. Evelyn touched the edge of the sign. Bruno sat beside her. The river moved below, no longer an enemy in the story, but a witness that had finally told the truth. Mara stood on the bridge as the wind came off the lake. Her eyes watered from the cold, though she would have denied it if asked. Caleb came to stand beside her and handed her a clean handkerchief without comment. I used to think my job was only finding the truth, Mara said. Caleb looked toward Evelyn, Bruno, and the little sign. Sometimes finding the truth is how you bring people home. Alder leaned against Caleb's leg. The movement was small, but Mara noticed. In Alder's kingdom, trust was never given by accident. 3 years later, on an October afternoon when Vermont's maples glowed red as lanterns, Mara Ellison and Caleb Rowan married behind Bellamy's diner. There was no grand ceremony, only wooden chairs, apple pie, lake wind, and the laughter of a town that had learned how to listen better. Evelyn sat in the front row with Bruno, older now and slower, his silver face resting against her knee. Alder stood near the aisle with the solemn posture of an honor guard. Caleb leaned close to Mara and whispered that if anyone forgot the vows, Alder would file a report on the spot. Mara laughed. They had not rushed love. They had taken 3 years to learn trust, patience, and the art of letting someone enter without noise. In the distance, the river still moved beneath Whitcomb Bridge, but it no longer looked like a place that had held fear. It looked like a place that had given back the light. In the end, this story reminds us that fear may follow a person for a season, but it does not have the final word. Evelyn believed she had lost her safety, her voice, and the quiet life she had tried so hard to build. Bruno, old and weakened, seemed like only a victim of cruelty. Caleb seemed like one more good man caught in the shadow of someone else's darkness. But grace has a way of gathering broken pieces that no human hand can fully understand. Sometimes God sends help in ways we do not expect. It may come through a faithful dog who refuses to give up. It may come through a stranger who listens when everyone else looks away. It may come through a quiet act of courage, a hand placed on the back of a chair, a warm meal left at a doorstep, or a voice that finally says, "I already did." Life teaches us that kindness is never small. When we protect the weak, when we believe those who are afraid, when we care for animals who cannot speak for themselves, we become part of something greater than ourselves. A dog's loyalty can reveal the truth. A wounded heart can learn to trust again. A river that once carried fear can become a place where hope returns. So in our daily lives, let us pay attention to the quiet people. Let us be gentle with those who startle easily, who sit near exits, who smile while carrying a storm inside. Let us treat animals not as objects, but as souls placed near us to teach patience, devotion, and unconditional love. The way we care for them says much about the condition of our own hearts. And perhaps that is where the miracle lives, not only in grand rescues or courtroom victories, but in the simple decision to do what is right when no one is clapping. To open the door, to speak the truth, to protect the innocent, to love again after fear has tried to close the heart. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Leave a comment about an animal who changed your life or someone who helped you when you felt alone. And if you want more stories of courage, healing, loyalty, and quiet miracles, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, your family, and every faithful animal who has ever stood beside a human heart in need. May He protect those who are afraid, guide those who are lost, and remind us all that even after the coldest river, light can still return.